In today's session, we'll be talking about creation. This is the story of the beginning itself. The biblical account opens with these words: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." This is a powerful way to start a creation story. Oftentimes we think that the creation story begins with the words, "Let there be light." But the truth of the matter is that there was this formless, waste, void, dark kind of mass of chaos that opens the story. And it is out of that God brings forth His creation. Now, there were many other cultures that also had creation stories. And in some ways, there might be some similarities. In other cultures, creation stories often featured many gods. These gods were often embattled with each other. They were engaged in power struggles, and horrific kinds of things could happen among the gods. Humans were often the pawns or the servants of the gods themselves and served at their pleasure. The stories can be fairly graphic and sometimes even grotesque. And although there is a sense in which in some of the other stories there's a measure of chaos and darkness and void and those kinds of images, the similarities stop right there. For as the story of creation in the Bible goes, God immediately begins His work of creation day by day. Oftentimes what we do not recognize as we're reading creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2 is that what we in fact encounter is a Genesis 1 story that just kind of bleeds over a little bit into chapter 2, and then a Genesis 2 story, or two frames or two accounts that tell the story in a slightly different way from a different perspective. Most of us tend to think of the creation story as one continuous account, where in fact what we have in this Hebraic setting are two beautiful stories coming together. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to lay out the two stories. These are features that you are already familiar with and that you know of, but as you see them and hear them in the particular frame in which they find themselves in the Bible, see if you can begin to hear which story is the story that you typically identify with, or that you can begin to hear what some of the distinctives are between the two accounts of creation. So, frame number one, or account number one, Genesis 1. In this story, God sets out in 6 days of work to create all that He is going to create. He begins obviously on day 1, and this creation culminates by the end of day 6. And every day of creation, God speaks something, and at His very voice, whatever it is that He speaks comes into existence. Let there be light. And there's a progression throughout the 6 days of creation. This progression leads to a moment of culmination, which we will look at in just a moment. But in the way that the creation account is given to us in Genesis 1, you can see, or you will hear, that it is very rhythmic, it is very poetic-like in feature, and there is a beautiful movement of balance to it as the story is told. So each day begins with God saying, "Let there be something," and it appears. And then in the context of especially those first 3 and 4 days, after God creates something, the act continues on. There's some sort of differentiation. In other words, God separates things out. He might separate light from darkness, or land from sea or water. And each day there is, after the initial moment of creation, there is an act of separation that goes along with that. At the conclusion of the day, God says, "It is good," and the day is complete. In this first frame, or this first account of creation, in the pattern in which it is told, in the rhythmic, poetic-like feature, which we hear as if we were listening to a song, we see that the culmination is the creation at the end of day 6 of male and female. And then the differentiation itself is that it is male and female, and beyond that there is no further differentiation. It is simply that at the end of day 6, after God had created everything that He had created, He created, as if it were in this story or in this account, in the same moment, at the same time, a male and a female. In this story, He makes them the image of God, or they are bearers of the image of God in the earth. This obviously distinguishes them from everything else that God has created. Although He has created things like sun, moon, stars, rivers, lakes, seas, oceans, animals, plants, creatures, there is only one thing in all of that creation, or in all of that creative work, that bears the image of God Himself, and that is male and female. It is as if when God had created everything else, He decided that as His crowning glory to all of this, He would create something that would be His representative, or would bear His image in the earth. And so there is this beautiful moment, there's this beautiful account in which the culmination of all of these 6 days of creation, all of them following the same kind of poetic fashion and movement, all of them leading towards this one particular moment in which God stamps creation with His own image through male and female. And it is in this story that God gives dominion to man and woman, or to male and female. It is in this being made in the image of God, and in whatever all of that means, certainly part of that is that they are given dominion. They are given dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the plants, the vegetation. In other words, God has created something and He has infused it with His image. And in that imaging of God on the earth, male and female are invited to share in God's dominion, or God's reign over all the things in the earth. So it is a very beautiful and poignant and powerful picture of what God has done. And then when God creates male and female, He actually says that this is very good. And He has a command that as male and female, they are to be fruitful and to multiply. And this is a way of God to express within this creation story that his dominion and his rule through male and female are to be extended, are to grow, are to expand. And so we have a beautiful story in which 6 days of creation culminate in the creation of male and female, in which God himself, by the way, says, "Let us make humankind in our image." And perhaps just something of an oddity about the use of the word us, and certainly the various things that it could mean. At the heart of this is the notion that God is a very relational kind of God. God is so relational that it appears that he is even in communal relationship with himself. And his desire is to create male and female in such a way that they too share in the relationship. So we have the story of a God, in one sense, going through the entire progressive, beautiful movement of creation so that he can create space, sacred time, sacred place where man and woman, male and female, can be created in his image and can have relationship with him. Then on the seventh day, God rests from all of his creative work and activity. The story goes on. The second account, from about Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 on, is an account that takes the centerpiece of the creative moment from the first account, that is the creation of male and female, and focuses itself on that particular creative moment itself. So in the second frame, or the second telling of creation, if you think about it in those terms, there is no mention of God creating the sun and the moon and the stars, of creating light, of separating night from day. All of that has been done, but there is something that continues in the story. The story is framed not so much in the poetic way that we experience the creation story of chapter 1, but now narrative, now far more clear story form. And in this story, God creates man. And in this particular framing of the story, creation of woman comes later in the story, but now God, from the dirt of the earth, blows into the nostrils of this dirt, and a man is formed, a living being emerges. So whereas in the first story, male and female appear on day 6, in the framing of the second account, the male appears, a man appears. Now there is more of a personal tone about this. There's more of an earthly feel about this. There's more of a local feel about this, for now God has created a garden. And he's doing all of this in the context of this garden that he's created. And there is now a man who is a living being. In this telling of the story, the creative activity of God moves forward, and he creates animals and other things, and as part of his giving and embracing the man that he has created, he allows the man to actually name the animals. From ant to zebra, Adam, or this man, is responsible for naming the animals that God has created. And after he does so, and all of that is done, it seems as if perhaps the creative activity of God has come to its conclusion. We have a man, we have a garden, and by the way, God has filled this garden with beautiful trees, beautiful to look at, fruit that is good to eat. And in the very middle of the garden itself are two particular trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And before there is any storyline in this particular account or in the second account of the creation of woman, God tells Adam that he is free to eat of any of the trees in the garden that he wishes, except for this one tree which has been placed in the middle, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Adam is told that if he should eat of that one particular tree, that death would ensue. It would be as if the floodgate of death would open in on the story. So, man has been created, he's been placed in a garden, and yet, after all of the refrains from the first account of creation, in which we hear the words, it is good, it is good, it is good, ultimately it is very good. For the first time, we hear something of a counter proclamation or a counter announcement from God. For now, in this very moment in the story, he says it is not good. And God sees that Adam is alone, and so to complement Adam, to bring partnership and relationship to Adam, God creates out of him a woman, Eve. So Adam falls into a deep sleep. God takes a rib from Adam, and from that rib creates woman. They are intended to not only from the first story reflect the image of God or to be the representative of God on the earth. They're not only invited to, in a sense, rule and reign with God on the earth. They're not only commanded to be fruitful and multiply, to extend the context of that story itself, and to enrich the relationships that happen within that story. They are also asked, or Adam is specifically asked, to, in a sense, be a custodian in the garden, to be a caretaker along with God in the garden. So, in the second frame, we have a far more local telling of the story, a far more tight telling of the story in the sense that we are in a garden. We're not talking about the largeness and the vastness of the universe. We're in a garden with trees, with two particular trees, with a mandate for Adam and Eve. The story is becoming more personal, and the story begins to take on more of an anticipation of what could possibly happen. What could conceivably go wrong in a perfect time, a perfect space? It is as if the garden itself has become the temple of God, where heaven and earth meet each other, and where the relationships are perfect and full and meaningful and fully enriched. What could possibly go wrong in a story in which Adam and Eve, man and woman, are the culmination and the climax of an incredible framing of the creation story? And now they find themselves in a garden with a God and with each other, in which there is no shame, no guilt. Adam and Eve are fully naked, and there is no shame between them. There is full transparency with their God, with each other, and with all of creation. Let's conclude by talking just briefly about this whole notion of why, or some clues as to why this story of creation is given to us in Genesis 1 and 2 as two frames or two accounts that are placed side by side. One way to come about this is just to recognize that this story of creation is a story of sheer significance. Oftentimes, when events or stories are at the level of significance that this story is, they bear telling more than one time. Or there's no way, perhaps, that one account can fully or sufficiently reveal or relay particular angles or nuances of this incredible creation story. So I'm going to suggest to you that as you read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and as you consider the uniqueness and the qualities and the poetic ways that Genesis 1 is kind of revealed, and the storyline as it is revealed even in that context, and then you read that against Genesis 2, in which it is more narrative, it is more local, that what we are in fact seeing is an incredibly beautiful, powerful way of presenting the creation story. And it takes a vision of both of them as you kind of keep an eye on one creation account and then keep an eye on the other and see how these stories connect with each other, appreciate the differences and the significances, and at the same time realize that this is one God, not many gods as in many of the other ancient stories. This is one good God who has done all of this, and the sheer significance of the story of creation begins to become more clear as we recognize these two stories. Another way to perhaps discuss this, talk about this, or reflect on this is that these two stories represent the sheer majestic grandeur of the story itself. These are not just small sub-stories, although it is a story with a continuation. The story of creation itself is a constant, continual theme throughout the entire biblical narrative, as we're going to see in the upcoming sessions. And in fact, as you already know, the scenes and stories of creation, in a sense, become the very place where we actually end up when it is all said and done with the concluding story, or the concluding image that we find ourselves in the book of Revelation. And also, there is an inexplicable mystery to the entire story. This is not the kind of creation story that science can logically explain or tease out. This is not the kind of story that is simply contained in just history alone, for what happens in it is trans-historical. Although it happens in a historical context, it happens in the sense of historical plane. But the story itself is filled with the incredible mystery of God that just simply cannot be contained and confined in the way the story itself unfolds and is told. So may I encourage you that as you reflect and as you enjoy your conversation of creation, the story or the stories, the account of creation, that you seek to appreciate and embrace both the poetry and the rhythmic ways in which the story is told, right along with the narrative ways in which the story is told, the universal context in which the story is cast, the local context, the more local context in which the story is cast, and with an eye toward what could conceivably happen with this man and this woman and the story that will unfold. And this will be just the beginning of God's grand narrative.